First up though, North Korea is willing to discuss denuclearization if the regime's safety is guaranteed. This is what a top South Korean envoy who met with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un told the media in Seoul after the delegation returned from Pyongyang earlier today. Now, both countries have also agreed to set up a communication hotline. The envoy said that Kim Jong-un is willing to suspend all nuclear and missile tests for the dialogue. This comes after the North Korean leader held a critical and historic face-to-face meeting with a top-level delegation from South Korea on Monday. Photographs released from Pyongyang show a smiling Kim Jong-un meeting with South Korean officials who later had dinner with the North Korean leader and his family. Live with me on the broadcast right now is WION senior correspondent Ramesh Ramachandran for more on that story. Ramesh, I don't want to jinx it, but this is quite a bit happening very quickly. First, the Olympic Games, his sister attending the competition there in South Korea. Now, of course, these talks happening. What do we make of these developments so rapidly taking place?
Rapidly is the word, Aisha. Fast-paced developments being reported from both North Korea and South Korea. This, as you mentioned, the visit of the South Korean delegation just concluded to North Korea. The delegation has returned to Seoul and they addressed the media just a short while ago. And the main points raised by the South Korean head delegation is as follows. It says North Korea has agreed not to use nuclear weapons against South Korea. That's point number one. Two, both sides have agreed to a summit in April next month. This would be the first in a decade. Remember, this would be the third summit. The first was held in 2000 and the second in 2007, both under Kim Jong-un's late father, Kim Jong-il. And this would be the third such summit between the two Koreas. The third point is that North Korea has agreed to a moratorium on nuclear and missile tests, provided the U.S. agrees to talk to North Korea. And the fourth point, North Korea says it is willing to denuclearize the Korean peninsula if its security is guaranteed.
And I suppose the meat of the matter lies in those last 2 points, Ramesh, because the United States has been conspicuously absent in these negotiations between the North and South. In fact, we've even heard senior members of the White House, let's say, announce a certain amount of skepticism about the speed at which these talks are taking place. Is that really going to be the crux or at least the pivotal point if these talks are to come through in terms of a positive change on the Korean peninsula?
Well, the point to be noted here is that although Washington is not directly involved in these talks, it is very much present on the fences, on the edges, so to speak. Remember, after this delegation has held talks returned to Seoul, it will now head to Washington for briefing the American delegation in Washington, the White House, as to what transpired in North Korea and to relay the information, the message from North Korea, from Pyongyang to Washington. So clearly, the Americans are very involved in these negotiations. This could be described as proximate or indirect talks, although not directly between Washington and Pyongyang just yet. But South Korea is mediating, so to speak, between the North and Washington. It will be interesting to see how U.S. responds to this new offer from Pyongyang in the hours ahead.
I think interesting is putting it rather mildly, Ramesh. This is, of course, something that's captured the globe's attention ever since President Trump has taken charge. Can I ask you this, though? Some of the charges made by Washington towards North Korea have been on charges as far as human rights violations go, something that President Trump and his senior officials have placed squarely the blame for on the Kim family. And so keeping the regime safe, that is a big ask on the part of North Korea, given who's negotiating on the other side.
Well, clearly, a big ask is the best way to describe it, Aisha, because both sides are approaching these talks from a position of maximalist stance, so to speak. Both sides are holding on to the extreme positions. It remains to be seen whether this gulf can be bridged in the days and weeks ahead between now and the summit, which will take place between the North and the South in April next month, and from then on, whether there will be direct talks between Pyongyang and Washington. But that said, as of today, the Trump administration is speaking with a forked tongue. His Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, says we can hold talks with Pyongyang. Trump says it's a waste of time. You better do something else. But we've seen in the recent weeks, especially in light of the Pyeongchang Winter Olympic Games, Aisha, where Vice President Mike Pence almost came to holding indirect or even direct talks with the North Korean delegation visiting the Olympic Games venue. But that was a non-starter. But that said, all three sides, all three parties, so to speak, North Korea, the South and Washington, are on the same page as we speak. But that said, there are lots of differences still remain to be resolved, especially on the issue of the nuclear issue, the missile testing issue. And by the way, this is one example of how sports diplomacy can aid or foster peace. Remember, the Chinese had used the table tennis diplomacy or ping pong diplomacy to have a rapprochement with the United States. This was in the almost 3 decades ago. And this time, the Winter Olympic Games, athletics could bring Washington and Pyongyang closer together if the peace talks go anywhere from here.
Absolutely. You mentioned three parties. Very quickly, last question to you, Ramesh. We've mentioned North Korea, South Korea, and of course the United States. But there is also the question of Russia. Russia has always spoken in many ways in folk tongues about the situation in the Korean Peninsula in the past, and of course there has been this question of how far the support for North Korea extends as far as Russia goes. Can we expect some sort of response, or at least any sort of comment from Russia forthcoming on these developments?
It's interesting you should raise the issue of Russia, Aisha, because Russia, for one, has spoken consistently on this issue. Putin down, every Russian official has said and maintained and insisted that sanctions on North Korea will prove futile and that dialogue is the only way forward. Putin reiterated this on the margins of the BRICS summit last year. Remember on the first week of September, when North Korea tested the 6th nuclear test, Putin made that in a signed article published by the Chinese media, where he said that sanctions will prove futile and that talks are the only way forward. So it remains to be seen how Moscow will respond or react to this latest peace overture between the North and South, and how China also said reacts to this new development in its immediate neighborhood.
All right, we'll leave it at that, Ramesh. A big story, of course, one we'll continue to track here. Thanks very much for bringing us up to speed on developments. Rapid ones at that, coming out of the Korean Peninsula. We'll look at that story, of course, a little later on this evening.